Now, I'm going to be completely honest. What I'm talking about here is not my idea. But I've suddenly decided that as a marketer, one of the most valuable things you can do, and this borrows, I think, a little bit on Taz's work, is give storytelling appeal to other people's good ideas. My wife is currently at communion at the cathedral. She's a vicar. I'm here taking care of the mammon. She's taking care of the God. And occasionally she gives me a hard time for working in advertising and marketing. And I have the perfect riposte, which is, well, you can criticize marketing all you like, but no one would have heard of Jesus if it hadn't been for St. Paul. And many, many good ideas don't just need someone to have them. They need someone to tell the story. Darwin needed Huxley, for example. And I think one of the most valuable things we can do is actually take great ideas which we think have been unfairly neglected, the kind of also-rans, the things that never quite made it, and just try and make them more famous. That's also true of technology, by the way. I think one of the best things you could do with technology is become a technology archaeologist, which is to go and look at things which narrowly missed it, often for quite arbitrary reasons. You won't realize this, but there was a period at the beginning of the last century where the electric car almost became the standard mode of transportation. There was a three-way kind of runoff between steam, electricity, and the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine, by the way, is by far the most complicated of those three modes of propulsion. Part of the reason electric cars may have failed, actually, is that at the time they were seen as female. Because they were quiet and very, very clean and didn't require a beefy person to wind a starting handle, they were actually seen as girly cars, which in the early part of the 20th century wasn't a great way to market cars. And indeed, Henry Ford marketed cars by racing them very heavily. So that business of actually taking ideas that nearly made it and thinking, do they deserve a second chance, strikes me as a perfectly worthwhile thing to do. So as I said, what I'm talking about is not my idea. It's the idea of a guy principally called Nicholas Gruen, who's my kind of economics Svengali. He's an Australian economist. Wonderful guy. By the way, if you want intellectual stimulation, go and look to Australia. And the reason for that, I think, is quite simple. That by being isolated, Australian thinkers kind of evolve in isolation, a bit like Australian flora and fauna. And as a result, you kind of get, kangaroo minds, the weirder kind of ideas often arise from isolated places. If you ever get a chance to go and see an Icelandic economist, go along and see what they have to say. So this is very much Gruen's idea with a little bit of help from Henry Tudor. And let me explain actually first with a little bit of an example. Okay? Some of you may be interested in driverless cars. I'm interested in driverless cars. I think there are very big problems to do with driverless cars. Not least that a driverless car with a bomb in it is kind of indistinguishable from a cruise missile. I think there are huge issues of, for example, what will happen if driverless cars always stop for pedestrians, which is that pedestrians will dick them around, okay? And so driving through a city centre in a driverless car will be an unbelievably painful experience because people will just walk blithely straight in front of you. I think there are a lot of problems, but I think it's interesting. But I think there's another interesting aspect of driverless cars, which is, for some weird reason, the software guys in Silicon Valley have all assumed that this is a problem we have to solve on our own. We have to produce a standalone car which, without any tinkering with road infrastructure, the way traffic lights work, the way roundabouts are designed, the way lights display to other road users that the car is actually driverless, so they can give it a bit of extra room and space on the road. Now, it'd be much, much easier, surely, to solve the driverless car problem if governments could agree to say, well, we'll put metal strips down certain motorways, which the driverless car can follow. Or we will change the design of traffic lights so that it is more obvious to a machine as distinct from a human being when it's red, green, or amber. We can have a new thing that needs to be on driverless cars so that other motorists understand that it's actually being driven autonomously. But nobody's doing that. No one's talking to government at all. And the whole assumption is this is a pure private sector problem which one brand, one company has to solve on its own with no cooperation from the people who actually manage the roads. And this seems to be emblematic to me of a kind of dichotomy, which seems to have come partly from neoliberal economics, which is that government has no part play in business whatsoever. It mustn't pick winners, it mustn't get involved, it mustn't participate in markets, it mustn't seek to influence markets. Its only job is to sort of get out of the way. Now, in some respects, that's probably not a bad principle, but it's a false dichotomy. Okay? I think there are occasions when government can actually play an active and encouraging role in getting businesses started and off the ground much, much faster by actually, to some extent, intervening in the marketplace. And this precisely is Nicholas Gruen's idea. He's not some sort of weird revolutionary communist or anything of this kind, but what he effectively says, he calls it government as impresario. And his idea is that there's the potential for public-private partnerships in building the public goods of the information age. And as he points out, the West's economic takeoff since the 17th century, yes, there was an awful lot of individual genius, quite a lot of it around these parts of Britain, by the way. You didn't know that actually champagne is effectively a Geordie drink, did you? Long before it was invented in France, there was improvements in northeastern glassmaking, which made it possible to ferment wine in the bottle. That was demonstrated to the Royal Society long before Dom Perignon claimed to have got in on the act. See? Now, a huge amount of it, by the way, in exactly this part of the country. And his point is that central banks, the legal apparatus of joint stock companies, public underwriting of new knowledges, initiatives like the British Admiralty's Longitude Prize, the government can play an active and positive role. It isn't necessarily a distortion, it isn't necessarily an obstacle. And I think we're suffering a little bit with our attitude to government of what you might call the J.R. Hartley problem. Now I suddenly realize that half of you have no idea who I'm talking about. And the other half are going, oh yes, of course, okay. J.R. Hartley was a famous advertising person. What we often forget about the wonderful J.R. Hartley campaign, he was using yellow pages to find a copy of his own book. That was the wonderful little conceit in the ad. And it was adorable, the most popular ad of the decade. But the point of the ad, it ended with good old yellow pages, we don't just help with the nasty things in life like a blocked drain. And the point was that people used, you don't even know what the yellow pages are, do you? Oh, shit. Okay. But people used directories at the time, before there was Google and the internet. People used directories basically if shit happened, but they never thought of using it for positive things. There was, by the way, in the yellow pages, which was a long yellow directory of people you could phone, there was always a single joke, by the way, which is, if you looked up boring, it said, boring, see civil engineers. But the marketing director, who later became the boss of Yellow Pages, which was a lucrative and powerful position at the time, made this point that everybody's looking to Yellow Pages if someone breaks your window or if your boiler packs up, but no one actually expanded usage into, wouldn't it be fun if? And I think that government is suffering from a kind of Yellow Pages problem, okay? In that it's become just for the nasty things in life, like a blocked drain or income inequality, and people have completely forgotten the fact that government, when well directed, can just make life a lot better and nicer quite easily, if it does it intelligently and if it knows when to get out of the way and when to intervene. And just as proof of this, I mentioned Henry Tudor, a great Welsh monarch. People dispute how Welsh the Tudors really were, but let's face it, look at him, right? Pop him in a rugby shirt, okay? You know which one he'd be wearing, okay? And he founded the Royal Mail in 1516. The Royal Mail is actually one of the oldest businesses in Europe. Now, the Royal Mail, when it was founded, it was partly controlled by government because they were obsessed with espionage and they were absolutely terrified of people's letters being read by other people. It was kind of like even more expensive than, you know, a kind of premier courier firm. It was basically for rich people and for government people to actually share information. Now, there's a problem with a mail service when only rich people can use it, which is, if you think about it, there's no point in writing to anybody poorer than you because they can't afford to reply, okay? So if if you're a wealthy aristocrat and you wonder if someone's free to sort out the drainage in the lower field, you can send them a letter saying, are you free on Thursday? And they might go, well, I am free on Thursday, but unfortunately I can't afford to write back. For a long, long time, you actually paid for letters on receipt, not on sending them. So you had to make a bet as to whether the letter was news from your son who was fighting in France or an invitation to join a Reader's Digest prize draw. And you couldn't tell until you'd paid the postman to receive the letter. Quite a lot of innovation, by the way, is around pricing. I looked at the very interesting YouTube history of Netflix. And Netflix, for the young people among you, was actually a DVD rental service before it was a streaming service. And they... in fact, Blockbuster turned down the opportunity to buy Netflix for only $50 million, which was probably a bit of a mistake looking back. But interestingly, that was at a time when Netflix hadn't cracked this, you pay a monthly subscription, you can keep 3 DVDs at any time, and every time you send a DVD back, you get a new one, but you don't pay late fees. That was the idea that suddenly kicked Netflix from being an also-ran to being the mainstream provider of DVD rental. And pricing innovation, the innovation of how you charge for things, is generally an underexplored field, I would argue. But anyway, as I said, Royal Mail was a service for the rich, and there's a limited value to a service which only allows you to write to and receive replies from people who are just as rich as you are, or people also employed in government. And then a man spotted, actually 2 people spotted, what if instead of making Royal Mail about few and expensive, we made it many and cheap. And that man was in part Rowland Hill. Now, it's worth noting that in London, for example, the 17th century, there were penny postal services, but they only allowed you to send letters elsewhere in London. And generally, you paid to send letters in proportion to the distance they were traveling. So if you wanted to send a letter to Newcastle, you wanted to send a letter to Edinburgh, it would cost you a hell of a lot more. Now, when you think about it, that seems kind of rational, doesn't it? You go, well, yeah, obviously, you know, the further the letter goes, the more I should pay for it. Actually, not really. And the person who had to do the maths that explained how a single, universal, 1-penny postal system with next-day delivery could work across the UK wasn't just some random mathematician they scraped off the street. It was actually Charles Babbage. He was, I think, at the time, he may not have been yet, the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge. He's also known, of course, as the kind of inventor of the difference engine, so in many cases is considered the forefather of the computer. He was a bloody thoroughgoing genius in other ways, not to say that Rowland Hill wasn't. But he made the point that in a network, which is what the Post is, actually, because of the consolidation of letters between, say, London and Newcastle and Edinburgh, the actual distance traveled by a letter in the company of 20,000 other letters adds absolutely trivially to the cost of carriage. And he said the reason you can have a single universal 1-penny rate, which is a brilliant innovation in pricing, by the way, because it doesn't just make things cheaper, it also makes things really bloody simple. How much does it cost to write to Barnstable? 1 penny, okay? He realized that nearly all the costs are actually in the first mile, the sorting, and the distribution. And the distance traveled is more or less irrelevant to the cost of carriage. And it took a genius mathematician to understand what was really network economics. The very, very early example of network economics. And by the way, they extended it I think in 1905, because I tried to find out how much Ramanujan had to pay to write to G.H. Hardy in Cambridge. Those of you who are mathematics nerds will know the story. I won't go into detail. Because I thought there was a clerk working in a shipping office in India, in Madras, I think. Okay, Chennai. You're right. Occasionally say Kenya. You've got to be careful these days. Okay. And I thought, wouldn't that be incredibly expensive for him to write to Cambridge? It turned out there was a thing called the Imperial Penny Post for a time, and it cost you 1p anywhere in the British Empire to send a letter, except for Australia and New Zealand, where you had to pay extra. Okay? And that was based on this fundamental insight of Babbage, which is that with consolidation, distance is irrelevant to the cost of carriage, which is kind of counterintuitive and really interesting. Now, an important fact, I think, or 2 important facts about the penny post. One, it didn't make money at first, nor would you expect it to, okay? And there are several reasons why. One of which is that 2 big forces that drive human behavior are habit and social copying. And if you're trying to get people to adopt a behavior which they've never done before and which nobody else does, it's very, very difficult. There's a lot of friction. You know, if you open a brand new bridge, what's weird is the volume of traffic on the bridge on day 1 is much, much lower than it is on day 700. because people have to get their heads around anything new. But also it's worth noting that at the time, a lot of people simply didn't know enough people far enough away to write to, okay? You know, people just weren't in the habit of going, that's weird, I could actually write to someone 300 miles away. It took them time to get their heads around this idea. The second thing is the idea, when you think about it, only works at a certain scale, right? In other words, this idea that distance becomes irrelevant to the cost of carriage only works assuming you have enough letters to actually bulk collect letters in London and ship them up the Great North Road in enough quantity so that there are, I don't know how many, I have no clue, 15,000, 20,000 on a single delivery. That kind of requires, in the early days of the idea, it kind of requires it to be a monopoly. Okay? And that's a problem because network goods are goods which only deliver their benefits or their economic feasibility at some scale, which means they tend to be loss-making at first. This was loss-making at first. For the first few years, it basically lost money. They had faith in the idea, they had faith in the mathematics. Eventually, it paid off, okay? But the Empire, I think the Empire Penny Post never made money, and I think they eventually abandoned it. It was probably done for symbolic reasons rather than anything else. But what that means is there is, when you think about it, a peculiar kind of good, which is a kind of network good, where the value of the good isn't just dependent on a transaction between you and the provider. The other users of the service, the people you can both write to and the people who can write to you, make the service more valuable. So the more people who use the service, the more valuable it becomes. Now, the reason that's odd, and this is the point that Nicholas Gruen makes, and by the way, there's always a chance he'll contact me and go, Rory, you're talking shit. But I think I've got Nicholas Gruen right in this, okay? This is how economists typically divide goods. You have private goods. That's something you buy yourself for your own consumption. You consume it, that means someone else can't have it, okay? Now, that means they are excludable, by which I mean you can charge for them, effectively. Can of Coke, okay? And they're rivalrous, which is if I consume a can of Coke, somebody else can't, okay? A lot of goods and most economic thinking probably sits around the realm of private goods. Food, clothing, cars, parking spaces. This is from Wikipedia, okay? Then you have non-excludable things, which are kind of rivalrous, but it's very difficult to actually charge for them. Overfishing would be an example of something where there is a limited number of fish, but it's very difficult to stop people overfishing, okay? Because you don't pay to retrieve a fish from the sea. Air, the atmosphere, fish stocks, timber, coal, free public transport is an example of that point, okay? You know, I suppose you might say a fireworks display would be a good example. Or would that be non-rivalrous? Interesting question. Now, a fireworks display that's crowded, okay? You can't really stop people from watching fireworks because they're up in the sky, okay? And then you have these non-rivalrous things, club goods, cinemas, private parks, satellite television, which are excludable but non-rivalrous in their consumption, in that my enjoyment of Sky doesn't prevent you watching Sky, okay? They're effectively there, okay? And in the same way, you have non-excludable, that's free-to-air, not excludable, non-rivalrous, and those things are free-to-air television would be a classic case. National defense, we all benefit from it, but it's very difficult other than through taxation, to actually fund it. Now, in a way, network goods have a few weird properties, one of which is they don't work at first. They don't work unless they have a certain amount of scale. Douglas McWilliams, who is the chief economist of IBM, made this point about network goods, that one of the reasons why progress may be stalling is that a lot of the progress is in network goods, and it takes time for them to reach a critical mass. You know, there are interdependencies going on, which means that there's no point, oh, sorry, you don't know what a fax machine is, do you? I suddenly realized. But there's no point in owning the world's only fax machine, right? Because there's nobody you can fax to. And then there's the strange thing that every time someone buys a fax machine, your own fax machine actually becomes more valuable, because now there's somebody else you can send a fax to, okay? Now, in a way, and I thought this was my original idea, network goods are actually add an extra row to this particular chart. Because in a way, they're anti-rivalrous. The more people who use them, the better they are. And you want a lot of people to use them. You could argue that Google's an interesting case because it's potentially excludable. They could just charge per search. but they realize that Google is ultimately more valuable if everybody can use it, because in part, every single person's search is contributing to the quality of Google's search results. So you could argue that it's a classic case of a network good, and I thought I'd invented this phrase being anti-rivalrous, which is the opposite of rivalrous, but it turned out it wasn't me, it was Stephen Weber, who's a tech guy. It's to some extent the opposite of a rival good. The more people who share it, the better it gets, okay? And I would argue that government has a role in promoting non-rivalrous goods and getting them to critical mass, perhaps by creating an artificial monopoly in the beginning. Because if you think about it, I mentioned the fact that the penny post didn't make money at the beginning, didn't make money for the first 4 years or 5 years until volumes reached a level where it became self-supporting. If you'd opened up the penny post to competition and there were 6 other people all providing their own postal networks of their own, I would argue it might have taken 25 years for any one of those to become profitable. Okay? Because each of them will be operating at a volume which would have been less than the feasible critical mass of volume, of use, for much, much longer. Because there would have been cutthroat competition between all parties. And, you could argue, I wouldn't argue, I'm 56 years old, that's Glastonbury Festival, and to me it's a vision of pure hell, okay? Festivals, I said recently, they're a bit like socialism, okay? It's very difficult to get there. Then you have 2 or 3 days of peace, love, and general altruism, and finally the toilets stop working, It's a little bit like that. But to me, okay, that's a vision of pure hell. I'd hate it because I'm kind of claustrophobic. I hate crowds. But I understand that among young people, the fact that there are lots of other people there is part of the benefit. If you think about it, if you had hundreds of different festivals all on the same week, all equally attended, okay, it wouldn't be better, it'd be kind of shit, right? And there are cases where you either things are natural monopolies, which to some extent they are, they're winner-takes-all effects where they become a natural monopoly, or they need to be monopolies or have some sort of monopoly, whether it's a brand monopoly or simple accorded monopoly, in order to reach the scale at which they become fabulous. Okay? Lots of little festivals added together aren't as good as one big one. That's why it's kind of anti-rivalrous. Okay? I mentioned the fax machine. It's kind of anti-rivalrous. Now, the advantage of the fax machine, you didn't need governments to get involved there because there was already a telecoms network which had been forced by governments to become open to all and interoperable. So the fax machine simply sat on top of an interoperable existing network, okay? If fax machines had required completely different wires to connect them, and you'd had 6 of those people operating different and incompatible fax networks, the fax would never have been a success. Now, this is what I'm saying, that there may be a kind of intervening stage of what you might call the network base, where government can actually provide absolutely common standards, but even common infrastructure, and then allow private... Now, I don't know how many billions of economic value were added to UK GDP by the existence of a working penny post system. But lots and lots of businesses used the post, even though the post was a monopoly and was effectively created by government. Then, as I said, there's always a problem because if you look at more Australian stimulus, the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, as I said, habit and social copying are really important in the adoption of any new behavior. New behavior tends to proceed on a sigmoid curve. It's slow at first. You can look at anything, acceptance of same-sex marriage, for example, attitudes to drink driving. Generally, there's a small group of people, then there's a period where people collectively change their minds very, very fast, and then you reach a kind of asymptote at the top. That's a common pattern. You would have seen it, by the way, in the adoption of mobile phones, for instance. That's called the Bass diffusion curve of new ideas. It tends to be sigmoid. The other point of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute is there tends to be in most businesses a kind of winner-takes-all effect anyway. But it strikes me that we've occasionally gotten, inverted commas, lucky because someone had a monopoly. Now, let me explain this. Now this is where the behavioral science comes in, okay? For a very early period, I think in the early days of the 20th century, something like 50% of the cars sold in the United States were Ford Model Ts. You had one player which was so supremely superior to anything else in terms of price and utility that effectively the decision was not, do I want to buy a car? It's, do I want to buy a Ford Model T? Okay? I would argue that Musk, with his billions, did the same thing. He made, for about 6 years, the decision was really easy. If you wanted to buy an electric car, you're going to buy a Tesla. And that makes it much, much easier for people to change their mind when they've only got to make one decision. Do I want this shit or don't I? Because if I do want the shit, I know what kind of shit it is I'm going to buy, right? Do I want to send a letter to someone 500 miles away? Because if I do, I go to the post office and I buy a bloody stamp, right? Sometimes competition in the early days of a new technology can not only destroy the network effects, the anti-rivalrous nature, by preventing any of the competing players from reaching the critical mass at which point the service generally starts to deliver its benefits, okay? But it can also just confuse the hell out of people. Now, I'll give you an example of this where I think sometimes easy choices make a huge difference to what people do. And this is my defense of why the British are very bad at learning languages. Actually, we're not bad at languages. We're very good at understanding non-English speakers speaking in a variety of completely different accents, okay? So we're quite good at understanding people from overseas so long as they speak English. Now, you know, that's not a totally useless skill. In France, if you get the gender wrong, they claim not to understand you at all, okay? But nonetheless, think about it like this, okay? If you're Dutch, you've got two questions to ask, okay? They're both pretty easy. Do I need to learn a foreign language? Well, the answer is pretty much, if you're planning to leave the Netherlands and to go to places other than small parts of South Africa and maybe some weird places in Indonesia, do I need to learn a language other than Dutch? Answer, yes. Second question, which language do I learn first? Easy answer, English. Not because it's the most spoken language, but it's the most widely spoken language geographically, okay? Learning English will help you if you go to South America, even if it isn't an English-speaking part of the world, okay? It'll help you if you go to Asia. It'll help you go to Scandinavia, okay? It'll help you talk to... I mean, the Scandinavians learn English not to speak to us. They learn to speak to each other, right? If a Swede meets a Norwegian, they'll probably speak in English and then start abusing each other, okay? Now think about it if you're a Brit, right? Bit more difficult, isn't it, right? Do I need to learn a foreign language? Well, not really sure. Which one should I learn? Dunno. Right? I mean, fair, right? Secondly, in order for your learning Dutch to pay off, it's not nearly necessary for you to learn a few words of Dutch. You've got to be better at speaking Dutch than the average Dutch person is at speaking English, which is going to take you 5 years' work, okay, before it starts to pay off. So choice architecture, which is what this is called, is really important. And I think sometimes too early competition messes up choice architecture. I'd love to buy an electric scooter or possibly an electric bicycle. The problem is there isn't a Tesla of electric scooters. And so I don't know which one to buy, so I end up not buying any of them, okay? I think there is a problem that the extent to which you can now imitate other products so rapidly using Chinese manufacturing actually means that the period of where you enjoyed a kind of Schumpeterian rent because when you invented something, it took 5 years for anybody to copy you, has now been reduced to about 2 months, which actually has negative effects on innovation. Because by the time I become aware of an innovation, there are 47 variants. You remember those duckboard, hoverboard things that were the big hit of Christmas, right? They weren't clearly branded. Nobody knew which one to buy. Some of them had weird lights and Bluetooth speakers attached. And then one of them caught fire under a Christmas tree while charging and set the house on fire. Because there was no clear branding to help your decision, nobody knew which product was adversely affected, so they reacted by boycotting the category altogether. It's where brands can play an absolutely essential part in both encouraging innovation and preventing early-stage problems from polluting the whole category. They're kind of watertight compartments, okay, within consumer choice. But that worries me, because sometimes you need simple choices. And I think Gruen's right. I think there are areas where the government, what the government could do is license one player to a monopoly for 5 or 6 years. It's kind of how the railways got built. Did you know, by the way, that the elder Stephenson, bit of trivia here, the elder Stephenson, the great Ravenry locomotive pioneer, had such a strong Geordie accent that when he went down to London, he was accompanied by an interpreter. I thought that was quite cool, right? You go, yeah, hoy, a great boiler on the bastard. I think, what Mr. Stephenson is saying is, okay, I think that's unbelievably cool, by the way, right? I think there are loads of areas where we could create common pool network resources with government sanction, sanctioned as a monopoly, with profits going towards the government, okay? And with some accountability to the electorate and to the customer, not only to the corporate provider, where we could do things that haven't been done but need to be done. I'll give you one very clear and banal example. We need a network, we need a locker network in the UK. Small, densely populated country with about 20,000 lockers. You could have a locker for collecting your stuff, groceries, deliveries, whatever, okay? This could be open. So local shops could use it. You could ring up your local shop and say, actually, I need, some milk or some whatever. I need a copy of this book. Can you just pop it in my locker, okay, by 6 o'clock this evening? It could actually facilitate local commerce as well as remote commerce, okay? Now, just to explain why this is, the biggest source of road congestion that in terms of what is growing as a form of traffic is delivery vehicles. The cost of delivering to 20,000 locations, remember Babbage, okay? The cost of delivering to 20 or 30,000 lockers is infinitesimally small compared to the cost of delivering to 20 million households. There are also advantages with lockers, by the way, which is you can deliver really early in the morning or really late at night, if it suits you. You can't deliver to residential areas at 1 o'clock in the morning because either you go nuts or your neighbors go nuts, right? Having a van turn up at that kind of time. I think what the government could do is license one player to enjoy a monopoly for 5 to 10 years, okay? And say, okay, you can make as much money out of that monopoly as you can, and we're licensing you to become the sole provider so that it has the greatest chance, both in behavioral terms and in network economics terms, of becoming actually viable and popular and commonly used. One thing for people to have to understand, one thing for them to have to learn. I think there has to be an opportunity, this is Nicholas Gruen, in pooling DNA health information in an anonymized form. That has to be done centrally, okay? Because the value of it depends on there being only one. The interoperability and the standardization of the format in which the data is presented has to be made uniform. I also think there's a chance of marketing doing this. I think the government could collect from consumers voluntarily information on what they buy, their purchasing habits, okay, and their intentions. And rather than making marketing this absurd game of chess, where people are using data from a variety of sources, from TikTok to Google, to try and second guess what people want, why don't you just ask them to tell you? Put it in a central form, then they pay with, and there are some government restrictions on the use, they pay to use that data to market more efficiently. Why not just centralize that instead of effectively paying loads of search engine optimization people to play a game of chess with Google, which is what's really happening at the moment. You're playing chess against someone else's algorithm. It's not an efficient use of time. Why don't you just have reason? Now, in Finland, to some extent, apparently it kind of works like that the government is the main provider of data. You can go to the government and say, I want people over 40 years old who have a house of over 200 square meters who heat their home with Coke. And they, by which I mean, the fuel, right? Okay? And they go, right you are, here it is. Now, they make money, the government makes money, it reduces the tax burden, and it's all done centralized, and it's all efficient. Now, that business of licensing a monopoly, okay, weirdly, it seems to be something that monarchies did to raise money all the time. When you had a monarchy, proper form of government in my opinion, when you had a monarchy, in order to raise money, one of the most common things they do is just license someone the exclusive rights to do something as a cash-raising thing. For whatever weird reason, and it may be the need to justify every decision, modern governments don't seem to do that to nearly the same extent. Okay, mobile telephone spectrum would be an example of it, okay? Where you license something for a certain period, for a certain use. But going back to Henry VIII's daughter, that's how the British East India Company got started. Now, I'm not saying the British East India Company was a good thing, but okay, I'll get beaten up if I do. What you can't say is that it was an unsuccessful business. It had an army of its own, which was larger than the British Army. Okay? Now, at some level, I think there's something that governments lost, which is a kind of intelligent intervention to create the conditions in which good ideas can actually get off the ground early with a slight hothouse incubation where they're granted a monopoly to the best provider, where the control to some extent sits equally with government and with business. That's part of the trade-off. And where I think you can start businesses that way, as indeed happened with the penny post, that you can't start the way we're trying to create them at the moment. That's what Nicholas Gruen says. Once again, the paper's called Government as Impresario, and I recommend it to all of you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Huge thank you. Just one quick question, because we are a little over time now. I mean, you know, we live in a time of such simplicity in terms of, you know, either cut taxes or not cut taxes or...
Yeah, it's the Overton window. I mean, the things government is kind of allowed to do.
Yes, that's right.
Are ludicrously constrained.
Yeah. So for me, you say monopoly,
yeah.
And I automatically think bad. And so the idea, and so I guess how do you move that Overton window so that actually we can indulge in the fact that actually no, so your argument is sometimes monopoly is good because it helps with anti-rivalrous goods and things like that.
I felt a bit sorry for John Major in a way, because he did one thing. Okay, it wasn't the best idea in the world, but he had some idea like the Cones hotline, right? And because he was talking about the Cones hotline, in other words, making people's journey better, rather than talking about, for example, GDP, annualized GDP growth, right? He was considered a figure of ridicule.
Yeah.
But I want to see government saying things like, there aren't enough public lavatories. What do we do? Okay? I've just had sciatica. This is what the chair's for. It's one of those psychological things where you don't necessarily need the chair. You just need to know it's there. Okay? It's a bit like being by the sea in hot weather. You don't necessarily go swimming, but it makes a difference that you know that you can. And, there are loads of things. If you want people to walk more, it suddenly occurred to me, what you actually need is not more walkways, it's more benches.
Right.
Because the problem with walking is that once you start walking, there's nowhere to sit down, right? Okay? And government could quite easily encourage things that make life better for people in all kinds of ways. I mean, you could, by the way, and this might be a Brexit dividend, you could be much, I would like to see, well, I mentioned Henry George, I won't go on about that because it tends to be a bit weird. But you could shift taxation from income to consumption. And you could have extremely different levels of taxation on consumption depending on how pro-social it was.
Okay.
Okay, that's just one example.
Sure.
So things which are rivalrous and competitively bought, luxury goods and unnecessary, luxury goods being the most extreme, you could tax very highly. Things which actually had a wider social benefit, you could tax very generously. And you could actually encourage more pro-social consumption that way. It doesn't make luxury goods any worse, by the way, because the people like the luxury goods precisely because they're expensive. So if you put the tax rate up, they actually become better luxury goods in many respects, okay? There are loads and loads of things that government could be doing to look at just consumption behavior and the environment, and they're constrained by economics into this extraordinarily narrow Overton window where you've got about 3 levers to pull.
Yeah. Indeed, yeah. It's frustrating as heck. Listen, Rory, thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.
Cheers.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That from you.
Fantastic.